For today's webinar, I am joined by my colleagues in the Wilderness Stewardship Division. This includes Roger Semler. He's the Division Chief for the Wilderness Stewardship Division and is based in Missoula, Montana. And then Tim Devine is our Branch Chief for Training and Development. And he's also the NPS representative at the Interagency Arthur Carhart National Wilderness Training Center. He too is located in Missoula, Montana. And then lastly, there's me, and I'm based in Denver, Colorado. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started, starting with Roger Semler. And Roger, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now.
All right, thank you. And I want to thank everyone that took the time from their other priorities during these challenging times to call in and join us today. And in particular, this is being provided in lieu of the 3-day training we had scheduled this week that we had to cancel due to COVID. So I'm going to present a few basic overview items regarding why do we preserve wilderness character in the National Park Service and why is it so important. Next slide, please, Aaron. And to put this into perspective, I want to first share with you some statistics regarding the status of wilderness in the National Park Service. So if you look at the pie chart here, in particular the green side of the pie chart that is labeled designated, that represents the designated wilderness in the National Park Service based on designation by Congress. We have 61 designated wilderness areas, and those are located in 50 National Park Service units. And those account for 44.6 million acres. The differential, by the way, between the 61 area and the 50 units is based on the fact that a few units have more than one designated wilderness area. In addition to the designated wilderness, we also have what we commonly refer to as the other category.
Mute on.
They include eligible wilderness, proposed wilderness, and recommended wilderness. And we've provided some handouts for you that further explain how we get to each of those categories. But when you add up the other categories of wilderness, we have an additional 50 NPS units and an additional 26.4 million acres in those categories. If you add up the designated wilderness along with the other categories of wilderness, it equates to over 80% of the 85 million acre National Park Service system. So based on statistics alone, the concept of preserving wilderness character and actually the both legal and policy mandate to preserve wilderness character applies to the vast majority of our acreage. By the way, the far right little excerpt from the pie chart represents the statistics for both recommended wilderness at 5.8 million acres and then either eligible and proposed at an additional 20.6. I might just add that the Alaska region accounts for a large percentage of these statistics with over 33 million acres of designated wilderness. Next slide, please. Based on the fact that we have these various categories of wilderness all the way from designated down to eligible, it's important to share this key policy, which is that for the purposes of applying our wilderness policies and the requirement to preserve wilderness character, the term wilderness will include all of these categories, not just designated wilderness, but also eligible, steady, proposed, and recommended wilderness. Potential wilderness could be a subset of any of these 5 categories as well. So when we say wilderness in the National Park Service or refer to wilderness policy, we are referring to all of these categories. Next slide, please. So, you might ask, we might ask ourselves, well, what is wilderness character? The Wilderness Act into itself did not have a specific definition, but yet the elements and the components of wilderness are embedded in the law itself. It was left to the interagency wilderness stewardship community, including the 4 agencies that manage wilderness, to identify a broader definition of wilderness character, which is presented here. It is a holistic concept. It's based on the interaction of 3 components. 1, the biophysical environments that are primarily free from modern human manipulation and impact. 2, the personal experiences in natural environments relatively free from the encumbrances and signs of modern society. And 3, the symbolic meanings of humility, restraint, and interdependence that inspire human connection with wilderness. Next slide, please. When we talk about why it's important to wilderness character, it's important to start with the highest level of protection of wilderness, which is the law. And so the Wilderness Act of 1964, in the Statement of Policy, Section 2A, begins the discussion on why wilderness character is important. So it states that a national wilderness preservation system shall be administered so as to provide for the protection of these areas and the preservation of their wilderness character. And as you look at a couple of the slides I have here, when we have an affirmative statement like a shall or a must, I've highlighted those in red to emphasize the importance that this is a must-do, not a maybe-do. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the Wilderness Act of 1964, in the use of wilderness areas, Section 4B, it states that each agency administering an area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area. So once again, we have an affirmative statement here with the word shall. Next slide, please. Moving on from the law, the next level of importance for preserving wilderness character would be National Park Service policy. Level 1 NPS policy is embodied in Management Policies 2006. And in Section 6.1, which is the Wilderness Stewardship chapter or section, in the general statement, we state that the purpose of wilderness in the national parks includes the preservation of wilderness character and wilderness resources in an unimpaired condition and in accordance with the Wilderness Act. Next slide, please. Moving on through Management Policies 2006 and Section 6.3.1, we continue to refer to wilderness character by stating that in addition to managing these areas for the preservation of the physical wilderness resources, planning for these areas must ensure that the wilderness character is likewise preserved. And once again, here in policy, we have an affirmative statement in must ensure. Next slide, please. Moving into Level 2 National Park Service policy, which are director's orders, our Wilderness Director's Order number 41, Section 6.2, Wilderness Character, states that whenever a park planning process that has the potential to affect wilderness character occurs, the park should determine how wilderness character can be both integrated into the planning effort and presented in the planning document. It goes on to say that wilderness character should be considered in the management and operations conducted by all divisions and work units. And this one is particularly important because preservation of wilderness character is affected by our daily field operations and our daily activities, not just specific planning efforts. Next slide, please. Moving on to another level in layer in Director's Order 41, Section 6.2 again, we state that wilderness parks will conduct a wilderness character assessment, which includes identifying what should be measured, establishing baseline data, and conducting ongoing monitoring of trends. And later in this presentation, Tim and Aaron will build that out further for you with respect to what is a wilderness character assessment. Next slide, please. And that is a brief introduction to the why wilderness character is important. And I just want to emphasize that it's built upon a foundation of the law, the Wilderness Act, and our very robust wilderness stewardship policies that are in Management Policies 2006 and Director's Order 41. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Tim to continue with the presentation.
All right, thanks, Roger. Roger just described the holistic concept of wilderness character and why it's important that we think about it. So let's take a deeper dive into the qualities of wilderness character, which you've probably heard of, or you will now. Next. So where do we find the qualities of wilderness character? Roger gave you a hint. You need to look no further than the definition of wilderness in Section 2C of the Wilderness Act of 1964. Can you guys pick out the qualities? Well, let me give you a little help. That's a lot of words on the screen. Next. Highlighted here are the 5 tangible qualities of wilderness character as found in the Wilderness Act definition, or the wilderness definition in the Act. And you hear most about these. So there's untrammeled, undeveloped, natural, outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined type recreation, and other features of value. Next. So these 5 qualities make up the tangible things that we monitor to understand the status and trends in wilderness character, which Aaron's going to go into more detail in a little bit. But we can't forget the intangible qualities. These are harder to monitor, and all of these qualities are ones that are mandated to preserve and protect. Let's take a closer look at each of these qualities. Next. Okay, we'll start out with the intangible qualities. These include our personal experiences in wilderness, which free us from the everyday hubbub of life. We also see symbolic meanings of humility, restraint, and the inspiration to connect with nature through art, music, reflection, mindfulness, etc. They are called the intangible qualities because they're kind of squishy. They're often used as descriptors in wilderness character narratives, but since they are harder to measure, you won't generally see them when we conduct the baseline assessments or monitoring of wilderness character. If you protect the next 5 qualities we're going to talk about, you will protect the intangibles as well. Next. All right, the untrammeled quality. This, according to wilderness scholars, is the primary ideal for wilderness. Although the word untrammeled is not a common one, Howard, the chief architect and writer of the Wilderness Act, Howard Zahniser, used the word untrammeled because it was the exact word to convey the importance of keeping wilderness free from manipulation and control. It's interesting to note that Howard didn't come up with untrammeled by himself. Pauline or Polly Dyer, a champion of Northwest conservation and the protection of Olympic and North Cascades National Parks, suggested Howard use the phrase untrammeled by man. She used it to describe the imperiled beaches in Olympic National Park in the mid-1950s when there was a proposal to build a road along the Olympic coast. She actually expressed that the coast and beaches should be free, uncontrolled, wild, or untrammeled. Next. So any action that would intentionally manipulate the biophysical environment or community of life, as the Wilderness Act puts it, is a trammel. Our actions to control natural processes such as fire suppression or putting fire on the land, interfering with the predator-prey relationships, spraying for invasive species. Yeah, sometimes there may be a good reason to trammel, but you have to be careful. Stocking fish and historically fishless lakes by our agency or even illegally by the public. I'm sure that many of you can think of other actions that we sometimes take to control or manipulate. We use the word modern in this statement to clearly separate the past, or prior to wilderness designation, the effects of native and indigenous peoples, which are actually an important part of wilderness, from the effects of modern peoples. Next. So natural. Before the description of wilderness character, the untrammeled and natural qualities were typically talked about together and often considered one and the same. However, in reading the Wilderness Act, literature about the Wilderness Act, and writings of people who contributed to the Wilderness Act, the strong sense we got was that untrammeled quality was about the actions managers take toward wilderness, while the natural quality is about the condition of the land or the effects of our action, not the action itself. We protect this quality to preserve ecological processes and learn from natural systems: air, water, vegetation, wildlife. Next. The natural quality is degraded by pollution, infestations of non-native species, loss of indigenous species, and the effects of altered natural processes. As you can see, the untrammeled and natural qualities may appear to be in conflict sometimes. It's not one versus the other. We must try to protect both. The trick is to determine what do you gain and what do you lose while trying to protect both. Next. Undeveloped. Pretty self-describing, don't you think? Without permanent improvement or modern occupation. Remember what the Wilderness Act says: to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas. This allows people to be free to feel part of and not apart from the natural environment. Next. Notice undeveloped is about degraded by non-recreational structures and installations, such as research or weather instrumentation, fire lookouts, ranger cabins. The recreational structures and installations are considered in the quality we'll talk about next. Also, the use of motorized equipment like chainsaws, generators, use of motor vehicles or mechanical transport degrade this quality. Do those sound familiar to you? They should. They're prohibitions listed in the Wilderness Act to guard against growing mechanization, as the Act says. Next. The next quality is outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined type of recreation. This is where we preserve pristine recreation and promote self-reliance. Solitude. Next. Facilities that decrease this self-reliance, such as two-storied outhouses and bridges, increased visitor encounters like the cable route on Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, or Conundrum Hot Springs in the Forest Service's Maroon Bells Snowmass Wilderness in Colorado, or restrictions that we place like permits, designated campsites, staying on the trails, don't do this, don't do that. Those all degrade this quality. Next. The last quality we'll talk about is the other features of value. These values may be of scientific, educational, scenic, or historic nature. National natural landscapes, paleo, and culture resource come to mind. These are things that make your wilderness special and stand out. Next. What these features are dictate how they're degraded. That could be by vandalism to rock art, loss of historic structures, or the outright theft of unique objects. Next. So that was real quick and dirty on the 5 or 6 qualities of wilderness character. So quickly, those are untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, outstanding opportunities, other features of value, and we can't forget about the intangibles. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin for a look at how we integrate all these qualities into what we do. So with that, Erin, take it away.
So we now know what wilderness character is, both the holistic definition and the breakdown by quality. And we also know that wilderness character preservation is mandated through the Wilderness Act and our subsequent NPS policy. Knowing what these conceptual ideas of wilderness character preservation are, how do we transform that into something tangible and discrete? That's what we're going to talk about next. So, every wilderness area, regardless of category, falls within this spectrum, which means that every wilderness area has a current state of wilderness character that is informed by our influence on that area. We recognize that different wilderness areas will fall in potentially very different places on this spectrum, and that's okay. We are not judging where a wilderness starts in terms of its location on the spectrum. And in fact, we celebrate the idea that we have a diversity of wilderness areas that represent a full suite of impacts to wilderness character and influences of modern society. More importantly, what we're really interested in is successfully preserving wilderness character means that we're aiming to stabilize or improve the state of wilderness character from the jump. This means that we are looking to thoughtfully limit our sustained and long-lasting impacts to the wilderness environment. And so in terms of this graphic, we would like to see that star remain stable or move up and to the left, which means that we are improving wilderness character in part by reducing our influence. So how do you do that? What does preservation look like on a local level? A good starting point are the wilderness character building blocks. These were first described in 2014 in the NPS Wilderness Character User Guide, which focuses on integrating wilderness character into park planning, management, and monitoring. There are 3 building blocks, and the blocks identify and emphasize approachable areas to focus initial and ongoing wilderness character preservation efforts. Ideally, a park would complete building block number 1, the wilderness basics, before initiating building block number 2. And we're going to focus on number 1 and number 2 for the rest of today. That isn't to say building block number 3 isn't important. It is super important. And unlike numbers 1 and 2, the building blocks focusing on integrating wilderness character into more daily management and operations can happen simultaneously with building blocks 1 and or 2. And of the 3 blocks, number 3 is the most prone to kind of ongoing, indefinite focus. We are always looking for ways to integrate wilderness character on small and more large scales, and that's where we would see those sorts of efforts. But as I mentioned before, today, for our time, we'll focus on building blocks number 1 and number 2. So, what are the wilderness basics? I like to think of the wilderness basics as a way to understand the place-based context of wilderness character in a park. Chances are, many of us have our own understanding of wilderness character in a park, whether it's the park we work in or a park we work closely with. However, it's a little less common that there is a shared understanding of what wilderness character looks like in a park. The wilderness basics are a qualitative and concise document that provide a prompt and structure for a park-wide shared understanding of the area's wilderness character. And this document reflects agreed upon ideas identified through interdisciplinary collaboration. By doing that, the document creates a common foundation and a reference point for subsequent wilderness character integration efforts, including the use of building block number 2. So what does the basics look like? There are 3 elements: a background, a narrative, and future planning issues. The narrative is probably the most well-known component of the basics. And in this narrative, which is really the bulk of the basics, we identify some of the biggest initial known threats to wilderness character of the area, as well as what are our wilderness character preservation successes. And these are kind of focused at a pretty broad level that could be further explored and gone into more detail through building block number 2. Because the wilderness character narrative and the basics as a whole are very qualitative in nature, the narrative is our chance to emphasize the more intangible qualities of wilderness character, because we're focused on description rather than focused on tracking change. We're looking to describe the current state and the elements of wilderness character that are present, less concerned about tracking changes in those traits and qualities, because we will do that with building block number 2. Speaking of, building block number 2 is our ongoing monitoring and our wilderness character baseline assessment. So what is this? Wilderness character monitoring helps us expand on the overarching themes described in the wilderness basics. Monitoring identifies a framework to tangibly track changes in wilderness character over time. And it really helps us answer the question, are we preserving wilderness character? If we think back to that grid, are we sustaining or improving the state of wilderness character in a specific place? So what does this look like? There's an interagency agreed upon and consistent framework for wilderness character monitoring. It was first described in 2015 through the interagency Keeping It Wild 2 technical guide. The framework describes monitoring rooted in the 5 more tangible qualities of wilderness character. And for each quality, there are 3 standardized components. The first are monitoring questions. These questions address specific management objectives or goals that are central to that wilderness character quality. So the example here is if we're looking at the undeveloped quality, one of the questions is, what are the trends in mechanization? That is a really broad question and very, very central to the intent and spirit of the undeveloped quality. But alone, it is so broad that we really can't track change in that over time by just looking at the question alone. And so we build upon the question through one or more indicators. An indicator is a distinct and important component of the monitoring question. It breaks the monitoring question into chunks that are more feasible to track change. But we're still not quite at the place where we can assign values and track change over time. And that's where the measures come in. Measures are something for which data can be collected to assess trend in the indicator. Like other monitoring programs, measures are measurable. Their name implies what they do. We can assign discrete value and compare changes in those values over time. Now, it's important to note that while this framework is standardized across the 4 agencies that manage wilderness, the measures piece is where we start to see some variation because the requirements about measures vary by agency. Specifically for the Park Service, there are no required measures that must be used for wilderness character monitoring. And instead, like the other agencies, the only requirement we have about a measure is that there's at least one measure selected for every required indicator. And in the Interagency Standardized Wilderness Character Monitoring Framework, there are 13 required indicators. So at minimum, if a park has a wilderness character monitoring framework, you will have at least 13 measures. In addition to the 13 required indicators and their related measures, you may also select optional measures and indicators for the other features of value quality. This is the one of the 5 qualities that is technically optional at any park at every level. And so again, the untrammeled, natural, undeveloped, and solitude or primitive and unconfined qualities are required to be monitored, and the other features of value quality is optional. With that said, I would say most parks still pick at least one measure for that quality and their indicators because it's kind of undeniable that there are other features of value in the wilderness area that can be tangibly monitored. So again, no requirements for measures, but we do have a couple of principles that we encourage parks consider when selecting measures. The first is that a measure is useful. Since there's no required measures, the primary reason for that lack of a requirement is to ensure that measures are locally relevant. So a measure, when selected, has to be useful in that it is locally relevant and ideally is applicable to help inform stewardship decisions. Second is simple. We are not looking for a park to tackle any and every conceivable measure possible for wilderness character monitoring. We know resources are limited, staff capacity is strained, and money is hard to come by. And so instead, we encourage the selection of the fewest measures that will still credibly track change in the indicator. And lastly, and related to this, is the idea of being practical. Measures inevitably will have to assess the cost effectiveness and sustainability of the measure. There's no reason to choose a measure that a park probably won't be able to commit to moving forward. We're looking for a commitment that is rooted in practicality. And this also means that where possible, measures selected should take advantage of pre-existing protocol and data. Wilderness character monitoring is a fairly young monitoring program relative to many other established monitoring efforts in the Park Service. And I see that as a benefit because we get to repurpose and reuse loads of very high quality data with very established protocol already being collected and developed by other monitoring efforts. It may take a little bit of a tweak in terms of adapting the focus or interpretation of the data, but we have many instances where existing data and protocol can be repurposed for wilderness character monitoring. So please do keep in mind usefulness, simplicity, and practicality when selecting measures. Now that we know what goes into the measure selection process, what does monitoring look like? You select the measures, you conduct a baseline assessment. So this is the first time that you're actually running calculations to determine a discrete value for each measure selected. Once you have that value, the data or value of the measure is entered into the Interagency Wilderness Character Monitoring database. This database serves as the repository for all measure data value, not only for the Park Service, but for the 3 other federal agencies that are part of the National Wilderness Preservation System. And then you conduct ongoing monitoring, just like any other monitoring program. So at minimum, every 5 years, a park returns to their selected measures and reassesses. They collect new values, and they again enter those into the database. And this is the stage where we can start to assess trends in an indicator, monitoring question, or wilderness character quality, because we can compare the value and data of a measure between monitoring years. Has it increased? Has it decreased? Has it remained stable? So at minimum, monitoring occurs every 5 years, and sometimes it happens more often because the measure requires that. But either way, our end goal is to be able to compare our baseline assessment values to measure values 5, 10, 15 years out, to be able to see, are we preserving wilderness character? Are we seeing an improvement in the trend of the measure and indicator? Are we seeing a reduction or a threat? And that helps us to answer the questions. We do have an exciting development related to this, and that is that in addition to the 2014 NPS Wilderness Character User Guide and the 2015 Keeping It Wild 2, we are in the process of developing an NPS-specific technical guide for wilderness character monitoring. This will expand on guidance from both of those previous documents that we've learned in the last 5 to 6 years. And in addition to clarifying areas of confusion, we have also worked with several subject matter experts from across the service to vet and develop optional measures that already include detailed definitions, protocol, and data sources that a park could use. So let's say you're at a park that has not yet completed a baseline assessment. You could refer to this technical guide, read through the overarching guidance, and then review the measures and potentially select one, some, or all of the measures, and already have a huge leg up on developing your wilderness character baseline assessment, because you aren't having to start from scratch, and you are using measures that are vetted by experts and take advantage of that repurposed and recycled existing data and protocol. So we're in the process of drafting that right now. We are doing some extensive internal review to make sure that it is sound and supported by all of our different disciplines that inform wilderness stewardship. And if you're interested in learning more about where this guide stands as of now, you can shoot me a note and I'm happy to give you the details. So with that said, we're going to wrap up by talking a little bit about how to get this building blocks work done, and Roger will share that and close us out. And Roger, you may need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Erin, and I'll make this relatively quick so we can save some time for Q&A. But you may be sitting there wondering, well, how can I get this done in my park unit, my wilderness park? So we've provided here a list of some approaches by which you can get this work done. The narrative, the building blocks, in particular the narrative, and even in perhaps more importantly, the baseline assessment. Let me start, though, by reminding everyone that in Director's Order 41, Section 6.2, Wilderness Character, we do state that wilderness parks will conduct a wilderness character assessment. So this is another one of those affirmative policy statements. So one of the first options here is to host a Geoscientists in Parks Wilderness Character Intern. We started this connection with GIP program a couple years ago. These are 20-week internships. At present, we have 2 allocated for this 2020 period. One is already committed at Cumberland Island. The second one is tentatively committed but not confirmed. And so we only have 2 funded this 2020 cycle, but one of those is not completely confirmed. And if someone out there is extremely committed to hosting one, you might want to give me a call. There are a number of commitments that a park has to make to host an intern, including office space, computer access, supervision, and perhaps most importantly, housing must be provided by the benefiting park and account. A second option here, and a really good one, is to establish a project agreement with the Denver Service Center. Our division works very closely with DSC to consult with and help with wilderness stewardship planning and in particular wilderness character building blocks. The DSC crew is extremely interested in and informed regarding wilderness, and through a project agreement that could be a good option for you to pursue this project. A third option is to kind of more do it within the park option, whereby the park would make it a priority, hopefully develop a interdisciplinary team to take this on and commit a fair amount of time to work on this and complete this project. Once again, the building blocks. In order to do that, you'll need, obviously, park leadership support. You'll need to commit and dedicate a fair amount of time. One additional way, though, for a park to do it in-house is to host a wilderness character workshop to kind of pave the way for the interdisciplinary team to work out the details. And a wilderness character workshop is something our Wilderness Stewardship Division offers to interested parks. The only caveat is we ask that you would cover the travel of a couple of us to come to your park and work with you on a workshop. That workshop, again, would be a good precursor to helping inform an interdisciplinary team to do the work in-house. So those are a suite of possible approaches to get this work done. And for each and every one of these, the Wilderness Stewardship Division, which, by the way, the entire division is on this webinar, Tim, Aaron, and I, but we are available for consultation and support for all of these options. And with that, I will turn it back over to Aaron to start our Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Roger. All right. So again, if you have a question for our team about any of the topics we very broadly and briefly covered during today's webinar, you can go ahead and submit that question via the chat box. And we will start with the first question, which is, are measures described in the upcoming technical guide required? And I can go ahead and answer that one. The short answer is no. The technical guide still follows our same policy on measure development as any previous guidance, and that is to say that no single measure will be required for use by all parks. Instead, the measures listed in the technical guide are very much optional and were identified as being likely applicable to many parks in multiple regions. Because we have been doing wilderness character monitoring now for almost 5 to maybe even 10 years, we have seen measures that are repeated across parks. And in instances prior, when a measure is repeated, it means that every park had to start from scratch to reach the same end result. So instead of saying, yes, we know this measure is pretty commonly used, good luck developing it, our goal was to outline commonly used measures that apply to many parks, if not nationally, and do the groundwork, or at least part of the groundwork for you. So I think it's important just to recognize no measure is required. These measures are optional, and you can use them in full, adapt them as you see fit, or choose not to use them at all. Okay. So the next question we have is related to the intangible qualities. And someone asked here how we know what an intangible quality is. What is the difference between a more tangible versus intangible quality for wilderness character? Tim, do you want to try that one?
Sure. The intangible qualities are kind of those squishy things that aren't easily measured. So reflection, spirituality, the inspiration people get from being in the wilderness. Those sorts of things are the intangible qualities.
Thank you.
And
Aaron, Roger, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that intangible qualities do not mean that they are inherently unmeasurable. We have some pretty advanced qualitative social research that can help us understand and measure intangible qualities. But those processes can be more complex and nuanced than some of the more accessible tangible quality treatments. And so if a park is motivated to measure and track changes in the more intangible qualities, that's certainly available. It's just not as commonly deployed because of some of the complexities involved. Okay, so our next question is someone saying that they have an older wilderness. The plan was probably typewritten. There's very little documentation on IRMA or in our park. Do we have any thoughts on how to find documentation about the park? And I'm guessing perhaps this is documentation related to what informed the eventual designation, or details that could help illuminate understanding of wilderness character.
I'll dive in on that one a bit, and I'm not sure if that example is from a park with designated wilderness, but obviously one of the first places to start is with your wilderness legislation. And of course, behind the scenes with wilderness legislation might be sources of congressional hearing documentation or other scoping related work that had been done at the park level. Of course, we have a myriad of other documents that are created in parks, foundation documents, general management plans, wilderness stewardship plans, some of which could be dated, but there could be some background information to any and all of those as well. The best place to find that is in your own park or regional archives, although obviously we do have access to all the wilderness legislation that has occurred to date.
And we, as a division, we do try to track on the same sorts of documents that this question was asking about and that Roger mentioned. And so it may also be good just to confirm, does our division have files or access to some of these things that are no longer in the park? And so if you send me a message, Aaron_Drake@nps.gov, I can at least confirm for you what we have, as I do manage a tracking sheet of information like this for each wilderness park. Okay. Well, those are all the questions submitted. If you think of a question later, feel free to send Roger, Tim, and myself an email, and we can follow up that way as well. We really thank you for joining today, and we are sorry to have postponed our training that we would have been in Wisconsin together for this week. Again, we appreciate your flexibility on that. Hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. And you are all now added to a mailing list that I maintain where future trainings, whether those are in-person or web-based, will be announced. So keep an eye out for more opportunities to continue learning about wilderness as we move forward.